oh my God, are we in a critical position now in terms of the US economy? Potentially. This is cataclysmic.
We've never seen anything like it before. That's even worse than 2008.
I wouldn't count him out yet, and it's far too soon. But what is the way out for him that is not utter humiliation? Are we reaching a Liz Truss moment? It's not hyperbole.
This is the largest transaction in the history of our country. And don't let some of these politicians go around saying, because I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything, sir.
It may be true that some countries may be metaphorically ringing up to kiss his ass. Maybe. But China, no. China are kicking his ass. Every bit as hard as Donald Trump is trying to kick theirs, with China raising their tariffs now against America to 85%. It is spinning out of control.
We're getting used to thinking the unthinkable. But try this one for size. Is Donald Trump now going to the place recently vacated by one Liz Truss? And is he going to end up in the same mess? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And we had discussed today not talking about tariffs and thinking, God, I bet everyone's kind of had it up to here with tariffs, and surely there must be some other things in the world that are really important that we could talk about. This is so all-consuming and getting so perilous for the state of the global economy that you kind of feel this wave is about to wash over all of us in some shape or form, that it's impossible to ignore, given Donald Trump digging in, the Chinese digging in, Donald Trump now threatening to widen even further and go after pharmaceuticals next, that this is only the start of the war. And yet we have seen today America now imposing higher tariffs than it has done for 100 years.
And China has responded to this by increasing their tariffs by another 50% on Donald Trump. We talked about this earlier in the week, the idea of getting into a trade doom loop. That now raises Chinese tariffs on US goods to 84%. Some analysts say that as a result of that, and not just analysts, actually the designer of, say, the iPhone itself has said today that should increase just the iPhone's cost from a typical $1,200 package in the United States potentially to $3,500 in the course of a few weeks and months. Now is a good time to buy tech. But the point, John, you've just talked about is the really, really startling one, because this is the moment, or it could be the moment, where this crisis starts to spill out just away from just inflation and away from consumer goods and away from trade, but into the heart of the financial system itself, which is on US treasuries. US treasuries being bonds, which is basically the cost of US government debt. And something very, very weird is happening in those bond markets right now, which is that investors, stock dealers and so on are selling US government bonds, which is not what normally happens in a time of crisis. At a time of crisis, because US government debt is traditionally considered the safe haven, the thing that you buy at a time of financial turmoil, now they are being sold. And there are people who believe that this could lead to a financial crisis affecting the whole global financial system.
Yeah, we used to talk about this odd phrase that the US networks always use, flight to safety. What does that mean? It means that in turbulent times, if you don't trust the equities, if you don't trust the stock markets, you end up putting your money in places that feel very safe, that you're not being high risk. Gold is one, sort of commodities would be something that you could tangibly hold. And the bond markets was the other one. The bond market is meant to be the sort of safe, risk-free way of placing your money. And when it goes down, it tells you something really fundamental, which is that the US is losing its status as a safe haven. The benchmark for pricing so many commodities is the bond market. And when it goes down, you're essentially saying, we have no confidence in what the US government is actually doing.
The markets are moving with their fees.
People are beginning to doubt the US ability to stay out of recession or to navigate its way through the whole trade war that it itself has initiated. And there was a big Treasury auction in the US yesterday, and that's when they sell off debt. It was the weakest response since 2023. In other words, if people aren't coming to this auction to buy bonds, it means they no longer believe that that is a safe place to put their money. They do not have the same confidence in the US government. And the other place to look is with what the hedge funds are doing, because the hedge funds borrow huge amounts of money off these supposedly stable assets, right, the bonds. They're now starting to unwind these trades as well. Any significant moves in the market, like on Liz Truss Day, creates a huge amount of financial stress. And that seems to be the point that we're getting to now.
And that is why when you say in the introduction to this podcast, are we reaching a Liz Truss moment? It's not hyperbole.
Yeah.
Obviously, but so much worse.
But
a thousand times worse.
Exactly, because of the size of the US economy compared to the UK economy.
And the fact that the dollar is at the centre of the world financial system in a way that sterling is not.
Exactly. So that if the Liz Truss situation had gone on, it would be a crisis in the UK. It would have been a crisis for UK pension holders because the pensions industry would have fallen over and, you know, all sorts of people who held their pensions would have been in really, really deep shit. But it wouldn't have led to worldwide contagion. What we are talking about now, potentially, I don't want to kind of, you know, catastrophize this, but oh my God, are we in a critical position now in terms of the US economy? Potentially, this is cataclysmic. What could unfold as a result of what one man has introduced?
Put it this way, US treasuries, US bonds are used as collateral for pretty much every financial transaction that takes place around the world. They are the backup plan. If your financial transaction is going to go wrong, then you've got US treasuries, US dollars behind it. So if there is doubt about the American ability to pay its debts, and as Emily said yesterday, they've got a lot of debt to finance over the course of the next year, trillions and trillions of dollars worth. If there is any doubt about a potential default on the US buying its debt, then the whole system freezes up. And we've never seen anything like that before. That's even worse than 2008.
Do you remember the political strategist James Carville? We've talked about him before on this podcast. He uttered the immortal phrase, "When I get reborn, I want to come back as the bond market." In other words, the bond market always tells the truth.
Well, we're joined now by Maureen Khan, the Times economics editor. And thank you so much for taking the time to explain. Look, we know that the tariffs have been introduced and that, you know, America has escalated them against China, China's escalated them against America, and so on. But what is happening in the kind of sense of treasuries and this kind of gilt market in America, and why should we care about what is happening there?
So the treasury market is the US government bond market. In the UK, we call our bonds gilts, so it's the equivalent. And we're seeing a very dangerous dynamic of synchronized selling, which is US stocks, which was the dominant story after April 2nd, they sold off. Then this contagion has now spilled into the bond market, and it looks like it's also spilling into the dollar. So any US denominated asset is now like a hot potato that investors, hedge funds want to drop. And this is a premium that you mentioned, gilts, that we're kind of used to in the UK because it was a so-called moron premium attached to Liz Truss. And I would argue that in some senses, Liz Truss makes what's happening, the Liz Truss moment looks like a storm in a teacup, because if you have a moron premium attached to the world's most powerful economy with the world's safest assets, the dollar and US bonds, and if nobody wants to hold them, then we're kind of at an all bets are off moment for the financial system. So it's almost hard to overstate how unprecedented the storm over financial markets could become if indeed this synchronized selling deepens.
Maureen, did I hear that right? Did you call it a moron premium?
So the moron premium was I'm going to give my props to Dario Perkins, who works for TS Lombard, who described this bizarre phenomenon which happened after Liz Truss moment, where the pound was selling off, but so were UK government bonds. And this basically happens when the market have lost confidence in the policy making of a country. We usually attach it to emerging markets. The UK sort of resembled an emerging market in the Liz Truss moment. We called it a moron premium because the policy making was pretty moronic. It's probably fair to say that the policymaking in the US is looking and sounding pretty moronic to financial markets, who are just desperate for any bit of news that this tariff stuff might just go away in any form. They're not getting that good news despite clutching at straws. And that's why this synchronized sell-off is happening. And I think it's unprecedented because we always thought the Liz Truss moment would never happen to a country like the US, because its assets, the dollar and US government bonds, are the safest asset in the world. When everyone is panicking, that's what you buy. Now they're panicking and they're selling it because of the panic generated by Donald Trump.
So we saw what happened with Liz Truss. the Tory MPs decided she was a liability. She had to go. Men in grey suits booted her out, and that was the end of Liz Truss. The same can't happen in the US. What if Donald Trump just digs in? Can the markets do what Congress won't do, or whatever else in America, because everyone seems so scared?
But that's the question. I mean, I would argue that it wasn't just the Tory party that booted out Liz Truss. It was the bond vigilantes which forced the financial panic to such a stress level that people's mortgages were going up and their cost of living was going to worsen. And we had a yank of 75 basis points increase in interest rates, which precipitated that political crisis. Now, you're right. In the US, the political dynamics are different and the market dynamics are different too. Right now, so the way that we sort of got out of the Liz Truss moment was by having a central bank which went in and it strategically intervened in the bond market by buying the assets that everyone else didn't want to touch, became a buyer of last resort. The mounting pressure is on the US Federal Reserve, a central bank that Donald Trump has in his crosshairs, to do the same thing. So far, we've heard very little. I think that is a natural step. In some ways, Liz Truss is quite a good model, or that the way that we handled that was quite a good model for the US to follow. But the question is going to be, are we going to get rate cuts? Is there going to be massive liquidity into the financial markets? Who is going to come and stem this panic? Because the panic is not going to be stemmed by the White House. I think it's fair to say in the next couple of days, we're not really going to see a retrenchment on tariff policy from the Trump administration, which actually, if anything, has widened it to things like the pharmaceutical sector and has become more aggressive on China. I might just quickly mention there's another geopolitical dimension which is really important. China and Japan are the two countries that are the biggest foreign holders of US government debt in the world. Right now, they're not selling those bonds. If they do, then we end up in a kind of geopolitical financial warfare where two countries that have been hit by tariffs, and let's just concentrate on China because it's the one that's really been hit by tariffs. If they decide that they want to really yank up the pressure on Donald Trump and the financial system, they can dump those bonds. And that's really why the scale of what we might be entering into is just really, as I said, is really difficult to overstate how almost apocalyptic it could be. Capitalism might be being sacrificed on, the ideological determination of this president. And that's, again, a bit of a Liz Truss thing. Ideology is really scary to people in the market. They just rather have practical policymakers who see where the winds are blowing and they change their policies as a result. This president is ideologically committed to tariffs. He's obsessed with them. He loves them. He thinks that they are a silver bullet to, regaining purchasing power for American workers and bringing back American jobs. There's very, very few, I would say, people beyond his immediate circle who think that way. And again, we mentioned the bond vigilantes. Wall Street is kind of turning. So there's private financiers, people like Jamie Dimon, who were cheerleading for Donald Trump only a few months ago. They're turning. And the screws are also turning in financial markets. So when do we get to the tipping point? I think given the nature of the kind of volatility in markets, and you get to this place where prices just become unmoored, you can really catalyze events very, very quickly. But again, it's the open question. It's more likely that the Fed will do something as a sort of palliative to calm things. And then we have to start thinking about where tariff policy is going after that.
Maureen, fantastic. Great to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, we alluded to it a bit in that interview. But does anything make Donald Trump change his mind? I mean, the solution, it's easy. Donald Trump reverses the tariff policy. But Donald Trump is then absolutely a lame duck, isn't he? Yeah. I mean, his signature policy, he fails and he has to press the reverse thrust button.
Or he blames it all on Pete Navarro, who is, the ideological messiah at the centre of this. There is a world in which Trump says, I left this all to Navarro and he messed things up. He's quite good at blaming other people. What I would say is that, we started this episode with him saying, all these people are coming to me. They want to make deals. 70 countries are coming to me to make deals. You cannot work out trade deals with 70 countries all at the same time. You can barely do it with 5 or 6. So, I mean, Donald Trump, and I remember this well because I was with him on stage in LA, he used to own the Miss Universe competition, right? And there is a way in which this is what Donald Trump is playing now. It's a beauty contest between all these countries. Who's going to flatter him? Who's going to wear their bikini in the best way? Who's going to come out and win the evening dress, part of the contest? He's playing the world off like it is some beauty pageant, and it just won't end well, either for them or for America.
I think this is now basically a power game and a tug of war of power between Trump and the markets. I mean, Trump has managed to, as we've discussed many times since his inauguration, he's basically vanquished in one form or another all domestic political opposition. Congress isn't standing in his way. Democrats are gone. No one in the Republican Party is standing in his way. The courts, a little bit to some extent, still a check on his power. This is his biggest test yet. because the bond markets are very powerful. We saw that in our own country with Liz Truss. We've seen it throughout our history, going back to the 1960s and 70s. Once the markets have you and your currency in their crosshairs, it is a very dangerous place to be. Now, the United States has very seldom, if ever, been in that position because, as we say, it's so economically dominant and it's got the world's reserve currency. This was not supposed to happen. But I go back to that thing that we've been talking about a bit, which is that, Donald Trump, I think, has simply overestimated American economic power. Because ultimately, if he'd thought through the logical extension of his own problem, which is he says, look at this, we've got these huge trade deficits. That's a problem. Okay, fine, that's a problem. But what that means is, by definition, if you have huge trade deficits, in order to keep your economy going, in order for the balance of payments to balance out, you need massive internal capital flows. You need the kindness of strangers. You need investors to be investing your country to make up for that deficit every single year. And America has never had that problem because America has been in demand economically for investment year after year after year. Donald Trump has undermined that confidence. And so he has taken America into uncharted territory.
There have been so many times, though, where you think, right, this is it, Donald Trump is finished. I mean, you can think of it, you can chart the course from when he announced that he was going to be running for the presidency in 2015 through to, kind of Pussygate, through to any number of scandals, January the 6th, to impeachments, criminal prosecutions, that you think, well, he can't rise from this, and he somehow does. I mean, I wouldn't count him out yet, and it's far too soon. But what is the way out for him that is not utter humiliation? And how does he execute a U-turn? Because it looks like the only way out of this is a U-turn.
We haven't even seen the full force of this yet. I mean, Maureen mentioned this in her chat with us a moment ago. But something that's very little understood is that one of the biggest owners of US government bonds is in fact China.
Yeah.
They have $750 billion worth of debt. Maureen said they're not selling it off yet.
Some people think they are.
If we suddenly see $750 billion landed onto America's shoulders, I think that's going to change things pretty damn quickly.
Do you remember Scott Bessent? We used that clip of him on the podcast yesterday saying all China has is a pair of twos in that kind of stupid poker metaphor.
$750 billion of
do you know what? They've got
debt.
a bit more than a couple of twos in their hand.
Yeah.
But this is what I mean about Trump overestimating his own hand and overestimating American power. Because as dominant as America is, it does rely on the kindness of strangers for that investment, for those capital flows, for what you've just said, Emily, of China not deciding to sell all of its bonds at once. And bear in mind...
There's no kindness left now.
No,
that's
exactly.
the point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was never really kindness in China's sense. Obviously, they weren't doing it to help America out. They were doing it because it benefited them, but also because they had an interest in keeping the world financial system stable. Right? But bear in mind, the US federal government this year has got to refinance $9 trillion of sovereign debt maturities, i.e. they have to pay off the bonds that come to their maturity, plus another $2.5 trillion in fresh borrowing. Now, some of that gets picked up internally with domestic borrowing in the United States, i.e. American companies and Americans buying those bonds domestically. But a lot of it doesn't. A lot of it gets picked up by foreign companies, pension funds, foreign states. Who would want to buy that debt now in these current circumstances? So, as I say, Trump is pushing the limits of American power and American economic power. Okay. And he may find that elastic just snaps.
So here's the question. The lettuce was Liz Truss. What is?
He's like a marrow.
Yeah. Do you think?
I think
he's
probably
got
a bit long.
A marrow. How long does a marrow take
a pumpkin.
to decay?
It looks like a pumpkin. Yeah,
a pumpkin works,
pumpkin
doesn't it?
Works. Yeah.
So somebody somewhere at the
too much.
Was it the Daily Star?
Too much.
It was the Daily Star.
Come on, Daily Star. I think you need to get your pumpkins sorted.
Bit early for pumpkins.
We'll be back after the break.
I certainly am concerned about the public health situation and the poor conditions we're seeing for people in Birmingham as the bin bags are piling up. We see rats and other vermin crawling around. That's not good for public health. I think this dispute has escalated way out of hand. It is totally unacceptable that Unite, the trade union in this dispute, has been blocking bin lorries from leaving the depot. I understand.
Well, that's Wes Streeting, the health secretary, talking about a story we're going to talk about now, which is a bit close to home, which is the ongoing, pretty appalling situation in Birmingham with a bin strike that has now been running for nearly a month. You might have seen over the last few weeks pretty grotty, horrible looking pictures of the streets of Birmingham full of rubbish endless rubbish that have been building up week after week, because bin workers in the city, which is Europe's, not just Britain's, but Europe's biggest local authority, began a strike on the 11th of March, so nearly a month ago, which is no closer to being resolved, with the council declaring a major incident on the 31st of March, citing obvious public health concerns. And this is all goes back to something we've talked about on the show before, but it's Birmingham's basic bankruptcy as a result of a long-standing equal pay claim brought by women workers of the council, current and historic, who have said that they were not paid the same amount commensurate with their jobs as men were over many decades. And essentially, it has, as I say, bankrupted the council. And the thing is that whilst this is terrible for Birmingham and terrible for the residents of Birmingham, who are 1 million strong, it looks likelier and likelier that similar pay claims could be brought to different councils across the country, which will imperil an already very parlous local government set of finances.
I think that's why you can't see this as a Birmingham local story. It's not a Birmingham local story. It's a story essentially about employment rights. And that's why we could see the same strikes in Sheffield, we could see the same strikes in London, we could see the same strikes really Brighton, around the country. And it's for this reason that essentially it asks a very kind of profound question, which is, if women are doing one kind of job and men are doing another kind of job, should there be parity in what they're being paid? Because the women cleaners on Birmingham Council, the cleaning jobs are predominantly done by women, are saying that they should get paid the same as the male binmen. The binmen are predominantly men's jobs. And I guess that opens up a whole raft, a whole bigger discussion, really, which is, are we trying to pay people the same thing for the same work? Is that gender parity? Or are we trying to recognise that even though they might be separate jobs, we don't want to end up in a place where the council is systematically paying its women less money than its men? And so the way they're reconciling this, or not really reconciling it, because obviously it's broken into strikes, is by capping what the bin men can own. Because, as you said, Lewis, the council's gone bust. Everyone knows the story of the bankruptcy of Birmingham Council. And so they haven't found the money really to pay people equally by bringing the salaries up, which is what would happen in an ideal world. So they're capping the higher salaries of the men.
And ultimately, you're left with the subjective judgment, because the key phrase is work of equal value. Yeah. So is the work of equal value of, you can think of any number of kind of big organisations where is the person working in the canteen doing work of equal value to the person who is cleaning the offices, to the person who is a manager, to the person who is... How do you decide what is work of equal value? Maybe you would say, look, if you're doing manual physical work that is exhausting, that is worth more than someone who just sits behind a laptop and presses a keyboard all day. But you've got a position now where the success of the Birmingham case, of the cleaners case, has set in train an explosion. Funnily enough, this legislation that they were able to use, the kind of bringing into the work of equal value, dates back to Thatcher. Yeah. Dates back to the period of trade union reforms when you were trying to kill, the power of the unions during the Thatcher years. But one thing that was part of that was this idea work of equal value should have parity. Now, I can understand if you go saying, years ago, I found myself in the middle of one of these things of, when I was the North America editor and the China editor was getting paid less. And, Carrie Gracie said, we're doing the same job.
Trade war!
You can see completely how that happens, where we are doing identical jobs. Yeah. But this is, one person is a street cleaner, the other person is mopping up in a building.
I think it's really interesting. It's fairness, right? We all get fairness versus market reality. And that's why I think this starts sounding a little bit Marxist when you dig in, because if there is a shortage, right, of bin people, I don't know whether to call them bin people now.
Refuse collectors. Dustmen
or refuse
If we were John Major, we'd say dustmen.
Exactly. But if there is a shortage of one job, right, then the way you would actually solve that is by saying, OK, we need to be paying people more. But they can't pay people more because they tend to attract men to the jobs. And then the women would say, well, what about us doing this job of equal value, even though there might be lots of women doing that job. And I think this is where, an ideal rubs up against the reality of what you actually need to get your city and your country working again.
Yeah, and there is the suggestion. I mean, you mentioned John about the legislation going back to the Thatcher period. There are some people who think that one of the reasons that this could spread or could become more problematic is actually of a far more recent piece of legislation, which is the Employment Rights Bill, which this new Labour government has just brought in, which will create something called the Fair Work Agency, which, although the government doesn't like quangos, it says is going to be a new quango. And some people think that that Fair Work Agency will actually try to instigate or to find, as part of its remit, exactly the sort of historic cases such as this, which they would then try and encourage there to be compensation for or recompense for. So this could potentially spread. But of course, there is the legal architecture, which matters, but there's the financial architecture, which is one of the other reasons it's been brought to a head, right? Because actually some of the reasons why this could spread and you could end up seeing other parts of the country with thousands of tons of rubbish on the streets is because, if you talk to Unite or you talk to some of the unions involved, they say it's not just about the fair pay claims, but also because refuse collection, which again is probably, not a sexy topic, but it is one which obviously really, really matters, has been subject to cut after cut after cut for about 15 years. We know that local government spending power has fallen between 20 and 40% on average, depending on the local authority. And there are a series of different strikes which are in the pipeline in the next few weeks and months in very different parts of the country. Emily just mentioned a couple of them there, Sheffield, Barnet and other places, as a result of cuts to local authority expenditure on refuse collection. So it's one of those things, weirdly, that, we talk about on the show so much high politics and geopolitics and all that sort of stuff. But this is a sort of thing which the visuals of it alone, if you haven't seen any of the stuff in Birmingham, I mean, it is terrible. The visuals of it alone, nothing screams decaying, destructive country which is on its knees, than bins on the streets and TV cameras.
It goes back to the winter of discontent.
Well, quite so.
Labour,
And it's particularly problematic for a Labour government
Exactly.
for precisely that reason. The folk memory, the cultural memory of the winter of discontent,
79,
even though most of the country actually probably now, most of the voters now at this point probably don't remember it, but that folk memory is strong. The bins going uncollected, the dead being unburied and all that sort of stuff. So it's dangerous for Labour.
Folk memory, this is Pied Piper land, right? It's the Pied Piper of Hamlet, essentially, where the descriptions are of rats growing so big on rubbish, they're the size of cats. The next day I saw a piece saying, the rats have grown so big, they're the size of dogs. And I was like, that really is inflation. Overnight, they've gone from being cat size to dog size. But I think the other thing, going back to the point you're discussing about the financial architecture of this, is that part of the problem has been for councils to get bills that included back payment. And again, I think that's a really...
For the equal pay stuff?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, as a woman
that's
who's been
what's
through...
Birmingham.
Well, completely. Yeah. I've been through... We've been on different sides of the...
Well, hang on. I wasn't on a side. I just found myself the poster boy of it. I mean...
Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm saying that as a male, editor, you found yourself kind of petitioning for the job you were doing, and as a female presenter, I found myself petitioning for the job and the disparity that I was doing. And actually, one of those questions, right, which is almost inconceivable, is if I've been underpaid for the last 20 years, where do I start, right? Where do I start getting parity for that? And if you've been overpaid or paid more...
We should remind people, right, because people might not remember it, but this was a whole period of...
In the BBC
in particular, right?
Yeah.
Where a series
the BBC
stories
and let's be honest, and other broadcasters.
Yeah.
But all that happened, it was thanks to Theresa May, interestingly. Theresa May brought in a piece of legislation that made companies show their salary. You show the salaries, I think it was public sector workers, and the BBC obviously was paid by the government, by the state.
The BBC had been pressured for some years to reveal its talent bill, and then they had to do
and
so.
that was Theresa
May. It became
May.
public for the first time.
And she pushed this partly because she knew it would reveal this gender
and it
pay
revealed that all of the
disparity.
male, generally speaking, that the male presenters, even on the same programmes, were getting paid loads more than
doing the
female
same
ones.
jobs in the same programmes, But of course you're then left, and it was very unfair in a way for the women. the whole question of should you be back paid, but you'll bankrupt the BBC if you say yes, right? So what do you do then?
But what was that like?
Horrific. I mean, it was
because you
it
were
was
talking to all of the other women
horrific.
presenters at the time, and it was a
it was a very good sort of show of solidarity in the sense that we all knew that we were trying to do something not just for our generation, but for every generation to come, which was obvious and deeply unfair. But the whole question, as I'm trying to say about back pay, is that you then, we see what happens. You push a council into bankruptcy. Where does that money come from? Does it come from disabled kids? Does it come from elderly people? Does it come from...
But in a way, that's not your problem, right?
It's not your problem.
You're the one. Why should you shoulder that responsibility? You should have been paid more to begin with.
And
right?
it's not the bin's problem, right?
Exactly.
This is where it comes back to. Everyone wants their rubbish collected. Everyone wants parity, and the two things are absolutely,
and the list of potentially affected areas is really long. Cumbria, Leeds, Bristol, Coventry, Southampton, Glasgow, Sheffield.
And we can draw up a map of the local elections, right, which are a month away.
Brighton and Hove alone is being faced with equal pay claims potentially amounting to tens of millions of pounds, with the first tranche of 400 legal claims being lodged in August 2024. I mean, sometimes these things, it's a bit like, think about it almost like a local government PPI scandal. It's like something that is historic, and then suddenly, because of, either changing values or changing sort of legislative framework, suddenly you find yourself with this bill that, in local authorities' case, they may well, in moral terms, should and must pay, and in legal terms, but where do you begin to get the money from in a situation where there is, as anyone who works in local government will tell you, there is just no money. There's often no money just to perform your statutory obligations with regards to, children's services, social care services, refuse services, and so on.
Just for the record, can I say that I was never an opponent of equal pay. I just found myself in a position where, compared to a number of other correspondents, and the weirdest day was when I was in my little office in Washington, D.C., watching the British Select Committee at Parliament discussing how John Sopel's pay was arrived at, and listening to the BBC bosses give inaccurate information, where I had to ring them up and say, you need to correct the record here.
And don't forget, today is also the day that you can hear our US episode, Newsagents USA. We're going to be speaking to a leading Democrat who is trying to bring in a law that could actually reverse Trump's tariffs. Can he get it across the line? We'll be hearing from him a little later. We'll be back tomorrow.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.